Hello, Charlie. It's me again. Yep, I was just snapping my fingers to show you that I could still do it. I'll tell you a story about how I got started with this whole prayer business. Maybe 40 years ago. Gee, that's a long time. I was going through a very difficult period with my kids, my wife, my family, my business. Everything seemed to be going downhill. And I kept getting depressed and more depressed and didn't seem like I was ever going to get out of this thing. And not being very religious, I didn't go to church or synagogue or any other place. I just didn't pray. But one day in the shower, I decided maybe I should call on God. So I said, well, what can I do? So I thought, and I said, what should I say? And the first thing that came into my mind was, one ever-loving, ever-living God, that's all there is. And I said it again. One ever-loving, ever-living God, that's all there is. And I sang it. One ever-loving, ever-living God, that's all there is. One ever-loving, ever-living God, that's all there is. And nothing happened for the first couple of weeks, but I felt good just singing it while I was soaping up and having a good time in the shower. And then all of a sudden, one day, I snapped my fingers. And I said, oh my goodness, I'm having a miracle. It seemed like about 15 years before that, I developed something called tenosynovitis in my hands. And the doctor said they wouldn't get any better unless I had an operation. But as long as I could manage to hold a piece of chalk in my hands, I used to be a teacher, I could get by. So I went the longest time, 15 years or so, without ever snapping my fingers and not being able to make a fist. And then I said, oh my goodness, this is my miracle. And then I said, what's the next thing I can say to my prayer? And the next thing I said was, one ever-loving, ever-living God, welcome to my world. And when I said that, all of a sudden I felt tingly all over. And later on somebody said your aura was expanding. And I could just felt like everything was getting bigger and better, and I felt so good. So then I said, one ever-loving, ever-living God, welcome to my world every day. And then things started to get better with just those two sentences. Okay, and that went on for a while. And then I said, I better embellish this. I better make a bigger prayer. So I said, okay, what's the next thing I could say? So I said, one ever-loving, ever-living God, thanks for all I have. And then another time I said, one ever-loving, ever-living God, praise be thy name. And then I said, and this was the hardest one for me to say, was one ever-loving, ever-living God, I love you. I don't know why that was hard, but it was. And then I said, one ever-loving, ever-living God, I trust you. And then I said, one ever-loving, ever-living God, please forgive me my sins, because I had lots of sins to think back on. Yes, my youth was not very, what should you say? I wasn't a model youth. And then I said, one ever-loving, ever-living God, please help me. Then I said, one ever-loving, ever-living God, please help my family. And I named each member of my family. Then one ever-loving, ever-living God, please help my friends. And I named each friend. And then as I developed a prayer list, I'd say, one ever-loving, ever-living God, please help everybody on my prayer list. And that's how I began to come back, and things turned around. My life got much better. Everything seemed to just flow. And I thought maybe that little prayer routine that I have would help somebody else. So there it is, Charlie, and I'll repeat it again for you. It went like this. One ever-loving, ever-living God, that's all there is. One ever-loving, ever-living God, welcome to my world. One ever-loving, ever-living God, thanks for all I have. One ever-loving, ever-living God, praise be thy name. One ever-loving, ever-living God, I love you. One ever-loving, ever-living God, I trust you. One ever-loving, ever-living God, please forgive me my sins. One ever-loving, ever-living God, please help me. One ever-loving, ever-living God, please help all my family, friends, and relatives. And one ever-loving, ever-living God, please help all the people on my prayer list. Well, that's the story, Charlie. I'll get back to you at another time. Bye-bye.